Okay, let's start. Number 1. Plato's Timaeus and Critias. You're in Athens in 360 BCE, and the philosopher writing these words down insists this isn't a story he invented. Plato says Atlantis was real, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, sitting beyond what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, destroyed and swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night, roughly 9,000 years before his own time. But here's the part that should stop you. Every map, every scroll, every claim in this video is, in some way, chasing the record Plato says this story actually came from. Here's why that's strange. In every other dialogue where Plato wants to make a philosophical point through invented story, he says so directly. Here, through the character of Critias, he insists the opposite. A true account, passed down through a specific chain of named people, repeated across two separate dialogues written years apart. That's not how Plato treats fiction anywhere else in his surviving work. I mean, think about that for a second. This is the founder of an entire school of Western philosophy, a man whose other writings get picked apart line by line for internal consistency, and on this one subject he breaks his own pattern and swears the source is real. So where did he say it came from? Not from a dream, not from a poet, from Egypt. Specifically, from a chain of transmission running through his own ancestor Solon, who Plato says traveled to Egypt generations earlier, and was told the story directly by a priest, using records the Egyptians claimed were older than anything the Greeks had ever written down. The location Plato gives, the timeline he gives, the scale he gives, none of it originates with him. He's telling you, in his own words, that he's reporting what somebody else showed him. And that raises an obvious problem. If the location came from a document, where is that document now? Nobody has ever found it. Not in the ruins of any Egyptian temple, not in any surviving papyrus fragment, not in any inventory of any library, ancient or modern. What survives is Plato's second-hand account of what he was told about a document he never personally saw. Everything else on this list, every map and manuscript and transcript you're about to meet, is somebody's attempt to fill in that missing original. Here's what makes classicists uncomfortable about dismissing this as pure invention. Plato is precise about details a storyteller wouldn't bother inventing. He gives specific measurements for the island's central plain. He describes a ring city, alternating bands of land and water, with a canal system connecting the rings to the open sea. He names the metals the Atlanteans mined, including one he calls orichalcum, which he says was second only to gold in value, and which no later Greek or Roman writer ever mentions using themselves. A myth meant to teach a moral about hubris doesn't usually need a metallurgical inventory. Fiction built to make a philosophical point tends to stay vague on the logistics, because the logistics aren't the point. Plato's logistics read like someone trying to remember a report, not someone composing a fable. The scholars who argue it's pure allegory have a real case too, and it deserves to be said plainly. The number 9,000 appears elsewhere in Plato's work as a symbolic figure. The story's structure, pride followed by divine punishment, matches a pattern he uses on purpose in other dialogues to warn Athens about its own ambitions. That reading is coherent. It's also not the only one that survives contact with the text. And there's a structural detail even the allegory reading has trouble explaining away. Plato didn't finish the story. Critias breaks off mid-sentence, in the middle of describing how Zeus is about to punish Atlantis for its arrogance, and the dialogue simply ends there. If Plato was building a moral fable start to finish, he never delivered the moral. He set up the punishment and then stopped writing, and no version of the text, no manuscript tradition anywhere, completes it. A parable needs its ending. This one doesn't have one, and nobody has ever explained why a philosopher, who finished every other argument he ever started, would leave his most famous invention hanging. The tablets, in this case, aren't even in a museum. They don't exist anywhere we can check. The dialogue is in London and Athens and university libraries around the world. The record it's describing has no forwarding address at all. If you're looking for where the trail actually starts, it doesn't start with Plato. It starts one step earlier, in a temple in Egypt, with a priest whose name almost nobody remembers. Number 2. The Sais temple record. You're in the Egyptian city of Sais, inside the temple of the goddess Neith, and Solon, the Athenian lawmaker and Plato's own ancestor, is sitting across from a priest old enough that his own memory reaches back further than most nations' entire written history. Solon has come to talk about Greek history, proud of what he knows. The priest listens, and then, according to the account, tells him something that must have landed like an insult. "You Greeks are always children," the priest says. "Not one of you has any old belief, based on long tradition, and no knowledge hoary with age." It's an insult dressed up as a fact. A direct claim of superior record-keeping made by a named institution to a named foreign dignitary, and it's the actual origin point of the entire Atlantis story. According to Plato, the priest explains why. Greece keeps losing its history to periodic catastrophes, floods and fires that wipe out written records and force each generation to start over from illiteracy. Egypt, protected by its geography, never loses anything. Its temples keep unbroken written archives stretching back further than the Greeks have any concept of. And it's from those archives, the priest claims, that he can tell Solon a story about Solon's own city that the Greeks themselves have completely forgotten. A war, 9,000 years earlier, between ancient Athens and a naval empire called Atlantis. Plato doesn't name this priest. That detail comes centuries later, from Plutarch, writing around 100 CE in his biography of Solon. Plutarch identifies him as Sais of Sais and calls him the most learned of all the priests, the man Solon specifically sought out to obtain the story. That's a level of specificity that's hard to wave away. A named city, a named temple, a named priest, cross-referenced by a second ancient author writing independently, centuries apart. But here's the detail that everyone misses on the first read. Sais doesn't just tell Solon the story out loud. According to the account, he's reading it. He's translating it, on the spot, from records physically kept in the temple, the same way you'd read a report off a page instead of reciting it from memory. That means, if the account is accurate in even its broad shape, there was a physical document. Something inscribed, something archived, something that existed in a specific building in a specific Egyptian city in the 6th century BCE. And no, I'm not making that detail up. It's in the text itself, not something added later by conspiracy writers. Plato has Solon describe the priest consulting sacred writings as he speaks, the way you'd expect an archivist to work, not a storyteller improvising. Solon himself was one of the most respected lawgivers in Greek history, not some minor visitor, the man credited with writing the foundational legal code of Athens itself, the kind of figure whose word carried weight precisely because he wasn't known for exaggeration. Plutarch describes him traveling to Egypt specifically to study with its priests, treating the trip as a serious research expedition, not a tourist's detour. Plato's own account of how the story reached him is surprisingly short on handoffs too. Solon told it to a relative named Dropides. Dropides told his son, and that son, an old man named Kircher, recited it to his own 10-year-old grandson at a boyhood festival, the same grandson who narrates the story decades later in Plato's dialogue. Only a handful of named links, by Plato's own telling, separate a real Athenian statesman standing in a real Egyptian temple from the account written down generations later. So what happened to it? Sais, the actual city, is real. Archaeologists have excavated it. The Temple of Neith was real too, one of the most important religious sites in the Nile Delta for over 1,000 years, described by later Greek visitors as one of the wonders of Egypt. But temple archives in ancient Egypt were written primarily on papyrus, and papyrus survives only under very specific conditions, dry-sealed tombs, not active working temples exposed to delta humidity, and eventually, the site's near-total demolition in later centuries for building stone. If the record Sais was reading from ever existed in that temple, it almost certainly didn't survive the temple's own destruction. Here's something worth sitting with. Sais handed a visiting Greek statesman a story about a war Solon's own ancestors supposedly fought and completely forgot, using Egypt's own archives as the only surviving witness, not some flattering founding myth about his own culture. That's an unusual thing to fabricate. Most invented traditions flatter the person you're telling them to. This one tells Solon that his entire civilization is a footnote in someone else's much longer book, which means the entire modern hunt for Atlantis' location, every map and manuscript in this video, is chasing a copy of something a priest read out loud 24 centuries ago, from a document that no longer exists in any form anyone alive has ever seen. The first physical object anyone claims actually shows where that lost record pointed doesn't turn up again for another 1900 years, and when it finally surfaces, it's rolled up in a palace in Istanbul, not a temple. Number 3. The Piri Reis map. You're inside Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in 1929, and a German theologian working through the palace's old collections has just unrolled a section of gazelle skin covered in ink that hasn't been read in centuries. It's a world map dated 1513, signed by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. The admiral wrote his own notes in the margins, explaining that he compiled it from roughly 20 older source charts, some of them, by his own account, going back to the age of Alexander the Great, and at least one attributed to a map used by Columbus himself on his voyages west. That alone would make it one of the most important surviving maps from the age of exploration. But the detail that turned it into something else entirely is what it appears to show along the bottom edge, a coastline curving away from the tip of South America that, according to American professor Charles Hapgood, matches the coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. That's not a small claim. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered by any expedition until 1820, more than 300 years after this map was drawn. And the coastline Hapgood is describing has been buried under an ice sheet for longer than recorded human history exists. In his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood argued the topographical detail was accurate enough that whoever originally surveyed that coast would have needed some form of aerial capability just to map it that precisely. Hapgood held a faculty position at Keene State College in New Hampshire, not some fringe writer working alone in a basement. And years before he ever wrote about Piri Reis, Albert Einstein personally wrote the foreword to an earlier Hapgood book, Earth's Shifting Crust, laying out the same crustal displacement theory Hapgood would later use to explain the map. Einstein signed off on that foreword in May of 1954, less than a year before his own death. That doesn't make the Antarctica claim correct. It does mean one of the most respected physicists in modern history thought the underlying question, whether the Earth's crust could shift dramatically enough to bury an entire mapped coastline under ice, was worth putting his own name behind. Here's the detail that everyone missed when this first went viral. Hapgood never claimed Piri Reis personally sailed to Antarctica. His argument was that the admiral was copying from older source maps that no longer survive, drawn by a civilization advanced enough to chart the world before the last ice age buried the evidence. Other writers ran further with that idea than Hapgood himself did. Some connected it directly to Atlantis, treating the lost source charts as the missing physical record the Sais priest had been reading from all along. The Swiss writer Erich von Daniken picked up the claim too, though he pushed it in his own, considerably stranger direction. Piri Reis himself never makes any Atlantis claim at all. That's worth sitting with. He was a career naval officer, later executed by the Ottoman state on unrelated political charges, and his marginal notes read like a working cartographer's citation log, not a mystic's confession. He's telling you where he got each piece of the map, the way a modern editor credits a source. If those older source charts really did encode a coastline nobody in 1513 had any business knowing, Piri Reis was bragging about how far back his sources went, not hiding them, without ever once claiming to understand what he was actually copying. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Nearly everyone else in this video is a theorist working centuries after the fact, squinting at a document and building a case for what it must secretly mean. Piri Reis is the only person on this entire list who was actually there, holding the source materials himself, in the 16th century, close enough to the original charts to describe exactly how many of them he used and where each one came from. He just never told anyone what he thought those older charts meant. He only told them where he got them. The pushback arrived fast, and it's worth stating plainly. Modern cartographers who've overlaid the Piri Reis map using its own intended projection, instead of rotating and stretching it to force a match, find that the southern coastline lines up reasonably well with the South American mainland continuing south, not with a separate, ice-free Antarctic landmass at all. The match Hapgood spent a career defending depends heavily on how you're willing to bend the map to get there. If you're enjoying this rabbit hole so far, subscribe, because it only gets stranger from here. Because Hapgood didn't stop looking after Piri Reis. If a 16th century Ottoman admiral really was copying from a lost, far older source map, that source map should show up again somewhere else. And in 1959, digging through the Library of Congress, that's exactly what Hapgood believed he'd found. Number 4. The Oronteus Finaeus map. You're inside the Library of Congress in 1959, and Charles Hapgood, still years away from publishing his book, is going through the map division's oldest holdings when he pulls out a world map drawn in 1531 by the French royal mathematician Oronteus Finaeus, Latinized as Oronteus Finaeus. Unlike Piri Reis's fragment, this one is complete, a full projection of the known world, and stretched across the entire bottom of it is a massive southern continent, drawn with rivers, mountain ranges, and coastal detail nobody in 1531 should have had any way to verify existed. For someone already convinced the Piri Reis map preserved a lost, Ice Age-era survey of the world, this looked like the second piece of the same puzzle. Hapgood argued the Finaeus map's southern landmass matched Antarctica's general outline too closely to be coincidence, drawn nearly 3 centuries before any European ship confirmed the continent existed at all. This decision seemed small to most historians at the time. It wasn't, because Hapgood's work landed in the hands of a Canadian librarian named Rand Flemath, who took the theory somewhere Hapgood himself never fully committed to. In his own books, Flemath didn't just argue an advanced ancient civilization once mapped Antarctica. He argued Antarctica was Atlantis, buried under ice by a sudden shift in the Earth's crust that carried the continent from a temperate latitude to the pole in a geological instant. That's the theory known as Earth crustal displacement, and it's not a fringe footnote. It went on to directly shape Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, one of the best-selling alternative history books ever published, which pulled the Antarctica theory in front of a mainstream audience that had never heard Hapgood's name. That's not a typo. A single 16th century French map, sitting quietly in a government archive for 400 years, became the load-bearing evidence for relocating the entire lost continent to the bottom of the world. Think about the chain that had to hold for that relocation to work. A French mathematician in 1531 has to be copying, accurately, from a source map nobody has ever recovered. That source map has to preserve a coastline surveyed before an ice sheet buried it tens of thousands of years earlier. The civilization that surveyed it has to have possessed navigational or aerial capability nobody credits any Ice Age culture with having. And every one of those links has to hold, at the same time, for the conclusion to stand up. Drop any single link, and the whole chain collapses back into an unusually detailed guess about a landmass European sailors already suspected existed somewhere south, because classical geographers had been speculating about a counterbalancing Terra Australis for over 1,000 years before Fine ever put pen to paper. But here's the detail Flemath's critics keep pointing back to, and it deserves to be said as plainly as the theory itself. To make the Finaeus map's coastline actually line up with real Antarctic topography, Hapgood had to rotate the entire projection by roughly 20 degrees and shift the position of the pole itself by about 1,000 miles from where it's now known to sit. That's a serious redraw of the map's own geometry, enough to make it say what you already believe it says. And the Earth crustal displacement theory itself carries a problem that has nothing to do with old maps at all. Modern geologists who have studied how the Earth's outer shell actually behaves point out that a crust shift violent enough to relocate an entire continent by dozens of degrees of latitude in a single instant. The way Flemath's version requires should leave enormous, unmistakable traces everywhere on the planet at once. Catastrophic global flooding on every coastline simultaneously. A worldwide layer of disturbed sediment, all dating to the same narrow window. Every ice core and seabed sample taken since has instead shown a slow, continuous record stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, with no single sudden event that fits the scale the theory demands. Every map in this list so far shares the same structural problem. Somebody finds an old chart, spots a shape that resembles something it shouldn't, and then adjusts the projection until the resemblance holds. It happened with Piri Reis. It happened again here. What nobody had done yet, in over 2,000 years of searching, was find a document where somebody had written the word Atlantis directly onto a map, on purpose, without needing to bend anything to make it fit. That document exists. It was printed in 1665 by one of the most respected scholars in Europe. Number 5. Kircher's Atlantis map. You're in Rome in 1665, inside the study of a Jesuit priest named Athanasius Kircher, a man so widely respected across Europe that his contemporaries called him Master of 100 Arts. He corresponds with popes, runs one of the great museums of the age, and is putting the finishing touches on Mundus Subterraneus, a book that will become the first published treatise on geology in Western history. And bound into that serious, scholarly volume, sitting between engravings of volcanic systems and underground rivers, is a map with one word written across it in Latin: Atlantis. Kircher didn't stumble into drawing this by accident. He placed the island deliberately in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, oriented with south at the top of the page, the way many maps of the era were drawn. This isn't a modern researcher squinting at an old coastline and arguing it might be Atlantis if you rotate it far enough. This is a 17th century scholar drawing the island exactly where he believed it had been, and labeling it as such in a book meant to be taken as serious natural science. Understand who Kircher actually was before you dismiss this as a curiosity. He held one of the most prestigious academic chairs in Europe, at the Collegio Romano, nothing close to a fringe pamphleteer, and Mundus Subterraneus itself is credited by historians of science as the first serious attempt to systematically describe the Earth's interior, its volcanoes, its underground water systems, its mineral deposits, using observation and correspondence gathered from across the continent. This is the same book, and the same working method, that made Kircher one of the most cited naturalists of his century. The Atlantis map sits inside that same volume, treated with the same seriousness as every other plate in it. And here's where it gets genuinely strange. Kircher claimed his placement was based on ancient Egyptian source material he had personally studied, not guesswork, the same civilization Plato's account traces the entire story back to in the first place. Kircher spent years working through Egyptian hieroglyphic material, most of it we now know incorrectly, since the actual key to reading hieroglyphs wasn't discovered until more than a century after his death with the Rosetta Stone. But he was convinced Egypt held real historical memory of Atlantis, and he built his map on what he believed those Egyptian sources were telling him. Read that again. A respected European scholar, working 200 years before the Rosetta Stone made real Egyptian translation possible, believed he had found Egyptian documentation locating Atlantis in the mid-Atlantic, and he considered the case solid enough to put his name on a printed map. Kircher was wrong about how hieroglyphs worked. That much is settled fact. Later scholars examining his translations found he was essentially inventing symbolic meanings for signs he couldn't actually read, confident readings built on no real linguistic foundation at all. The same failure mode you're going to see repeat itself later in this video, with an entirely different ancient script. But the specific location he landed on, open ocean between the old world and the new, sits almost exactly where Plato's original description points, beyond the pillars of Heracles, out past the edge of the known Mediterranean world. Two men, separated by 2,000 years, working from completely different source material, arrived at roughly the same patch of ocean. It's worth asking what that agreement is actually worth. Kircher had almost certainly read Plato's own account before he ever drew his map, the same way any educated 17th century scholar would have, so the two placements aren't fully independent at all. Kircher may simply have been drawing an illustration of Plato's own description and dressing it up with an Egyptian pedigree he genuinely believed but couldn't actually verify. That doesn't make the map worthless as evidence. It does mean the confirmation might really be one confident man agreeing with the same original text everyone else in this video is also chasing. That's the closest thing to independent confirmation this entire trail has produced. It's also, as you're about to see, nowhere near the end of it. Kircher's map still circulates today, reproduced in art history collections and rare book auctions, filed under natural science history rather than mythology, which is exactly the shelf Kircher himself intended it for. He never once frames the Atlantis map as speculation dressed up for entertainment. It sits in Mundus Subterraneus with the same authority as his diagrams of underground fire and subterranean water systems, presented to a continent of readers who, in 1665, largely took his word for it. Because 350 years after Kircher printed his map, a formation matching Plato's description down to its shape turned up somewhere nobody expected to find it, sitting in plain sight, photographed from orbit. Number 6. The Richat structure. You're looking down from a plane window over Mauritania, in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and what comes into view below you doesn't look like anything the desert should naturally produce. Concentric rings of dark rock, ring inside ring, spread across roughly 25 miles of open ground, forming a bullseye so large and so precise that it's one of the most recognizable landmarks on Earth from orbit. It's called the Richat structure. Most people know it by its nickname, the Eye of the Sahara. Now go back and read Plato's actual description of Atlantis' central city one more time. He doesn't describe a random island. He describes a capital built from alternating concentric rings of land and water, connected by canals running out to the open sea, engineered on a scale no natural landform typically produces. Researchers who have studied the Richat structure closely enough to write about it point out that its ring pattern lines up with that description almost too well. The scale roughly fits a grand metropolis. The shape is close to a perfect bullseye. And Plato's own account puts the destruction of Atlantis around 9,500 BCE, a date that falls right at the end of the last ice age, exactly the period when the Sahara itself was transitioning from a lush, wetter landscape into the desert it is today. And that wasn't even the part that got researchers arguing. Because unlike every earlier item in this video, this one didn't require anyone to squint at an old map, rotate a projection, or trust a second-hand translation. This is a real, physical, geologically documented formation, sitting in the open, that anyone with a satellite image can go look at right now. That accessibility is exactly why this theory spread the way it did. Every previous item in this video needed a specialist to even find it. An archivist digging through a palace collection, a librarian pulling an old chart out of storage. This one needed nothing but a phone. Once high-resolution satellite imagery became something anyone could scroll through for free, the Richat structure's resemblance to Plato's rings turned into one of the most shared images in the entire modern Atlantis discussion, spreading through video essays and social posts faster than any physical document on this list ever managed on its own. But here's the detail that everyone chasing this theory has to explain, and it's not a small one. When geologists, classicists, and structural archaeologists have actually gone out and examined the Richat structure on the ground, the case falls apart fast. A metropolis the size Plato described, home to a naval empire wealthy enough to work metal and build canals, would leave behind exactly the kind of debris no catastrophic flood ever fully erases. Foundations, roads, broken ceramics, worked stone, graves, the dense, unmistakable rubble of a city that people actually lived and died in. The Richat structure has produced none of it, not a shard, not a wall footing. Nothing that any excavation has ever tied to human construction at all. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, and it cuts against the theory just as hard as the missing debris does. Every reputable geological survey of the Richat structure agrees on what actually formed it, a dome of uplifted rock that eroded unevenly over tens of millions of years, exposing rings of harder and softer stone in circular bands. It's an established finding, the same kind of erosion pattern you can find, at smaller scale, in dozens of other geological domes around the world. The concentric rings come from geology, not engineering, worn into shape at a scale large enough that from a plain window it just happens to look designed. So here's where that leaves you. The Richat structure is real. Its resemblance to Plato's own description is real, and honestly, it's uncanny. And the total absence of a single artifact anywhere inside it is also real. 3 facts, all true at the same time, all pointing in different directions. Geologists will also point out something the theory tends to skip past entirely. The Richat structure sits deep in the interior of the Sahara, well inland from the Atlantic coast, and no climate reconstruction anyone has produced puts open ocean anywhere near it during the time frame Plato actually describes. A naval empire needs a coastline it can launch ships from. Whatever built or shaped the Richat structure, it wasn't doing it within reach of the sea. If that's the strongest physical match in this entire video, and it still can't produce one broken pot to back it up, the next few documents on this list have an even bigger problem, because at least the Richat structure exists exactly as described. What you're about to see next was translated from a text that, by every modern expert's own admission, nobody has ever actually been able to read correctly. Number 7. The Troano Codex. You're in a jungle excavation camp in the Yucatan in the 1870s, and an antiquarian named Augustus Laplangan is standing in front of the ruins of an ancient Maya city, holding a translation of one of the only Maya bark paper manuscripts to survive Spanish colonization. It's called the Troano Codex, and what it appears to describe, according to Laplangan, is the destruction of an entire lost continent, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, because the translation itself came from somewhere shaky to begin with. Years earlier, in 1864. A French scholar named Charles Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg had attempted to read the Codex using an alphabet supposedly recorded by a 16th century Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa, the same bishop, worth noting, who personally ordered the mass burning of Maya texts as idolatry, and then, decades later, tried to reconstruct a phonetic key to the writing system he'd helped destroy. Working from that shaky foundation, Brasseur rendered one recurring term in the Codex as the word mu, and concluded it referred to a land that had been swallowed by catastrophe. Le Plongeon took that single mistranslated syllable and built an entire lost civilization around it. He identified mu directly with Atlantis, argued the Codex proved a sunken continent had once existed in the Atlantic, and went further still, claiming ancient Egyptian civilization itself had been founded by a refugee queen fleeing that catastrophe, a figure he named Queen Mao. Le Plongeon had real fieldwork behind him, not pure imagination, at least by his own understanding of the evidence. He and his wife Alice had spent years physically excavating Maya sites across the Yucatan, at Chichen Itza and elsewhere, documenting real architecture and real inscriptions long before most Western scholars took Maya civilization seriously as a subject worth studying at all. That fieldwork was genuine, and in places, ahead of its time. It's exactly what makes the Mu claim so frustrating to modern archaeologists. A careful excavator who did real, patient work on the ground built his most famous theory on a translation method that had no real foundation underneath it at all. Here's what the Troano Codex actually says, according to every qualified Maya epigrapher who has studied it since. Nothing like that at all. Modern scholars who can genuinely read Maya glyphic writing, using decoding methods that didn't exist in Le Plongeon's lifetime, have found no basis for de Landa's so-called alphabet as a real phonetic key, and no basis whatsoever for the word mu appearing anywhere in the text with the meaning Brasseur assigned it. The Codex itself is real, and its own history is almost as strange as what got claimed about it. What Brasseur and Le Plongeon were working from was only half the actual document, a fragment named Troano after the man who owned it. A second fragment, called the Cortesianus, surfaced separately and wasn't recognized as the missing other half of the same book until 1880, when a French scholar named Léon de Rosny finally matched the two pieces together. The full manuscript was physically reunited in 1888, and today the reassembled book lives at the Museo de América in Madrid, where it's considered the single most important object in the museum's collection, kept in careful storage while a faithful reproduction stands in for it on public display. Le Plongeon built an entire lost continent out of a translation of a manuscript that, at the time he was reading it, wasn't even complete. The land Brasseur and Le Plongeon described sinking beneath the sea does not exist anywhere in the document except in the imagination of two men working, a generation apart, from tools that never actually worked, and somehow it gets worse. Because once Mu entered popular culture through Le Plongeon's writing, later authors detached it entirely from any Maya source at all and relocated it to the Pacific Ocean instead, inventing an entirely separate lost continent that has nothing to do with Atlantis, nothing to do with Plato, and nothing to do with the actual contents of the manuscript that supposedly proved it existed in the first place. One mistranslated symbol produced two competing lost worlds. 7 documents in, and not one of them has matched the one before it. Subscribe now. The next one is the darkest turn in this whole video. Enter Cornelis over de Linden, chief supervisor at the Royal Dockyard in Den Helder, who, in 1867, brought forward a manuscript he claimed had been sitting in his family for generations, one that supposedly preserved a written record even older than anything Egypt, Greece, or the Maya had ever produced. Number 8. The Oera Linda book. For a while, the manuscript actually held up. It first surfaced in the Netherlands sometime in the 1860s, years before anyone outside Over de Linden's own household had ever laid eyes on it. Over de Linden claimed it had been in his family for generations, handed down and largely ignored until he finally had it examined. Presented as a copy of a 13th century Frisian text, its self-preserving oral tradition, stretching back thousands of years earlier, it told the history of an ancient people living along the North Sea coast, complete with its own alphabet, its own calendar, and its own creation story. And at the center of that story sits a landmass called Atland, which translates simply as Old Land, a homeland destroyed by earthquake and catastrophic flooding, its people scattering to found the cultures of Northern Europe. The book gives the disaster an exact date, 2193 BCE. That didn't last. Scholars of Germanic philology started picking the text apart almost as soon as it was published in 1872, checking its supposedly ancient language against everything known about how Frisian and other old Germanic languages actually developed over time. The language in the manuscript didn't behave like a genuine archaic dialect slowly evolving across centuries. It behaved like something constructed all at once by someone working from 19th century assumptions about what an old language should sound like. By 1879, the academic consensus had hardened into something close to unanimous. The Oera Linda book was a forgery, most likely composed within over de Linden's own lifetime. A manuscript claiming to be humanity's oldest surviving written record took less than a decade to get caught. The man who first published it, a respected Frisian historian named Jan Gerhardus Automa, translated and released the text in good faith, apparently convinced of its authenticity right up until the scholarly consensus turned against it. Over de Linden himself never publicly explained where the manuscript actually came from beyond the family heirloom story, and he died in February of 1874, only 2 years after publication, without ever settling the question of who, if anyone, had written it before him. And the date itself doesn't hold up any better than the language does. Modern geological surveys of the North Sea floor have identified when the actual land bridge connecting the Shetland Islands to Norway went underwater, and it happened around 5500 BCE, more than 3,000 years before the date the Oera Linda book assigns to the sinking of Atlantis. If there's a kernel of real geological memory buried somewhere inside this manuscript, whoever wrote it down got the timeline wrong by more than 3 millennia. So why is it even in this video? Because despite every mark against it, the Oera Linda book still gets cited today, on forums and in self-published books, as independent confirmation that a lost land really did sink somewhere in the North Atlantic within human memory. A forged document from 1872, describing a wrong date for a real geological event, keeps getting folded into arguments about a story first written down 22 centuries earlier by a completely different author on a completely different continent. And here's the detail that everyone missed about where this book went next, which is genuinely the darkest turn in this entire video. In the 1930s, a German translation of the Oera Linda book found its way to Heinrich Himmler, and he became so fixated on it that colleagues started privately calling it Himmler's Bible. On May 4, 1934, a panel discussion on the book at the University of Berlin became the direct impulse for founding the Onenarebe, the Nazi regime's own pseudoscientific research institute, built specifically to hunt for evidence of an ancient Aryan homeland. Even inside that regime, the book was controversial, rejected by other party ideologues, and eventually placed on the party's own list of forbidden reading. A 19th century forgery describing a sunken homeland ended up, within 70 years, shaping the founding of one of history's most infamous institutions, and then getting banned by the very movement it inspired. A forged manuscript that started out sitting in a Dutch shipyard supervisor's family attic ended up, 2 generations later, steering the historical obsessions of a regime that murdered millions. That's an afterlife almost no forgery in history ever gets. Every document so far in this list has been argued over piece by piece, one artifact, one translation, one map at a time. What happens next is different. One single book took every fragment you've heard about so far, Egypt, the ocean floor, the scattered myths of a dozen unrelated cultures, and welded them into one theory so complete that almost everything written about Atlantis since has been arguing with this one man's ghost. Number 9. Ignatius Donnelly's Antediluvian World. You're in Washington in 1882, and the man drafting this manuscript late at night is a sitting United States congressman from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly, not a professional historian or an archaeologist, a populist politician by day who spends his evenings compiling every scrap of Atlantis evidence he can find into a single unified theory. The book he publishes that year, Atlantis. The Antediluvian World, argues something far bigger than any single map or manuscript. Donnelly claims Atlantis was bigger than one lost island. It was the common source civilization for nearly every ancient culture on Earth, the shared origin point explaining why pyramids show up on both sides of the Atlantic, why flood myths recur across unrelated continents, why so many separate traditions echo each other in ways Donnelly believed coincidence couldn't explain. A sitting member of Congress, actively serving in office, publishing a theory that swallowed practically all of recorded civilization into one drowned island empire. He didn't leave the location vague either. Donnelly placed Atlantis specifically on top of the mid-Atlantic ridge, near the Azores, and his timing mattered here as much as his argument did. Just years earlier, the British survey ship HMS Challenger, followed by the American vessel USS Dolphin, had returned from the first serious oceanographic expeditions to map the floor of the Atlantic, and their soundings had revealed, for the first time in human history, that a massive underwater mountain range ran down the center of the ocean. Donnelly seized on that discovery immediately. Strip away the water, he argued, and what the survey data showed looked exactly like the outline of a sunken continental mass. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It shaped nearly every Atlantis theory published after it, directly influencing writers, occultists, and eventually the entire modern genre of fringe history publishing that still exists today. If you trace almost any Atlantis claim back far enough, in some form, it runs through Donnelly's book first. That's not an exaggeration about Donnelly's day job either. He'd already served multiple terms in the U.S. House of Representatives by the time the book came out, and he went on to help found the Populist Party, running for Vice President of the United States on its ticket over a decade later. He was already a nationally known political figure, not some obscure crank hoping to be noticed, and that's exactly why the book landed with the reach it did. A private theorist publishing the same argument likely gets a few hundred readers. A sitting congressman publishing it gets reviewed in national newspapers. But here's what most people never realize about the science he was leaning on. Plate tectonics as a field didn't exist yet in 1882, and it wouldn't be properly understood for another 80 years. By the standards of his own era, Donnelly was working from the single best data available, real soundings from real naval expeditions, and drawing the most obvious conclusion anyone in 1882 could have drawn from a mountain range nobody had ever suspected existed on the seafloor. He trusted real data. He just didn't have the tools to interpret it correctly, and neither did anyone else alive for generations. Once those tools existed, the picture Donnelly built his entire theory on came apart completely. The mid-Atlantic ridge isn't a sunken landmass at all. It's a spreading center, the boundary where the American, European, and African tectonic plates are actively pulling apart from each other, constantly generating new ocean floor. Most of it sits at depths of over 1.5 miles below the surface, and by every measurement geologists have, it's been rising for its entire geological existence, never once above water, at any point science can measure. And this is where the pattern from every earlier item in this video repeats itself one more time. Donnelly was reading raw oceanographic data, straight from the source, real soundings from real naval expeditions, and he still landed on the wrong location, because the science needed to interpret that data correctly hadn't been born yet. Every document in this video shares that same shape somewhere. Real material, read through the wrong lens, producing a location that felt certain at the time and came apart the moment better tools arrived. Donnelly gave the theory its shape, its scale, and its staying power. What he didn't give it was a testable prediction, something that could actually be checked against a real event, on a real date, in the real world. The final document on this list is the only one that comes with exactly that. Number 10. Edgar Cayce's Atlantis readings. You're in a quiet room sometime in the 1930s, and a man named Edgar Cayce is lying on a couch with his eyes closed, dictating in a trance state while a stenographer takes down every word. Cayce had no formal medical training and only a grade school education, yet by this point in his life, he'd become known across the country as the Sleeping Prophet, delivering what he called readings on everything from a stranger's illness to the deep history of the human race, all while claiming no memory afterward of anything he'd said. Cayce delivered thousands of these sessions across his life, on subjects ranging from medical diagnoses to ancient history, and a striking number of them return again and again to the same subject. Atlantis, not as a myth but as a civilization case described in specific, consistent, recurring detail across readings given years apart to people who had never spoken to each other. According to those readings, Atlantis fell because of its own technology, not an earthquake, not a war, but the catastrophic misuse of a crystal-based power source that the Atlanteans had built their entire civilization around. As the island broke apart, Cayce claimed, survivors scattered in 3 directions, carrying their knowledge with them to Egypt, to the Yucatan, and to a small island chain in the Bahamas called Bimini. And in each of those three locations, according to the readings, the Atlanteans hid an identical hall of records, a vault containing the complete history of their civilization and prophecies for the future, inscribed onto materials built to outlast time itself. Clay, platinum, crystal. Pay attention to that number. 3 separate locations, 3 separate hidden vaults, each one supposedly containing an identical copy of the same lost archive. The same original record this entire video has been chasing since Plato's own account. Number 1. Here's where it stops being just another prophecy nobody can check. In one specific reading from the 1930s, Cayce stated that a portion of Atlantis would rise again near Bimini, and he attached an actual time frame to it, sometime around 1968 or 1969. That's a real dated specific claim made on the record, decades before anyone could confirm or deny it. In 1968, on schedule, divers working off the coast of North Bimini Island discovered an underwater formation of massive, flat limestone blocks arranged in a pattern that looked, to many who saw it, distinctly artificial. It became known as the Bimini Road, and to Cayce's followers, its timing was the fulfillment of a prophecy delivered nearly 40 years earlier by a man in a trance who had never been to the Bahamas in his life. Not a coincidence. Mainstream geologists studied the formation too, and their conclusion runs the other direction entirely. The blocks, they argue, are naturally formed beach rock, a common process where shoreline sediment cements into flat, regularly fractured slabs that can look engineered without any human involvement at all. That's the kind of coincidence that makes geologists genuinely uncomfortable, a natural process producing a shape that lines up, almost too neatly, with a decades-old prediction of exactly where and when something would appear. Cayce died in 1945, more than 2 decades before the Bimini Road was ever found, and never lived to see whether his own prediction played out. The organization he founded to preserve his readings, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, still operates today out of Virginia Beach, still maintains all 14,000-plus transcripts in its archive, and has funded multiple expeditions over the decades to search the waters off Bimini for a haul of records that has never once turned up. No haul of records has ever been recovered in Bimini, Egypt, or the Yucatan. Not one crystal tablet, not one platinum inscription, nothing that any archaeologist has ever verified. 10 documents, 10 locations, 10 different named people across 24 centuries, all convinced they'd found where the original record pointed, and every single one of them still contradicts the others. Every one of these 10 items is a real object or a real transcript, held by a real archive, credited to a real named person, willing to put their reputation behind an exact location. And after 24 centuries of searching, the closest anyone has come to the original record Plato described is a pile of unread contradictions. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and subscribe if you want to know the second the next one turns up.